The first light of dawn struggled to break through the smoke, hanging over the fields west of the Meuse. It was early morning, cold enough for frost to cling to the hulls of abandoned vehicles, and the silence felt unnatural, the kind that only appears when a battlefield is holding its breath. Hours earlier, this stretch of ground had belonged to Germany's proud armoured vanguard, a division forged in training grounds and celebrated in propaganda. Now it was littered with burnt-out panzers, collapsed half-tracks, and the shapes of men who had run out of luck during the night. Somewhere in the haze an engine tried to start, coughing weakly before falling quiet. The ground trembled beneath distant artillery, each impact creeping closer. Survivors, those few who hadn't been captured, killed, or separated in the chaos, crouched in shallow ditches, staring toward the road that had once been their path forward. The 96 hours behind them felt unreal. A blur of ambushes, failed counterattacks, shattered communications, and a growing realization that the division's reputation could not shield it from the hard limits of fuel, terrain, and time. And to understand how such an elite force unraveled so quickly, we must step back to the days before the nightmare began. By the time the events of this 96-hour collapse began, Germany's armoured warfare machine stood at a critical crossroads. In the early years of the war, panzer divisions had carved through Europe with speed that stunned entire governments. Their reputation was not just military, it was psychological. Wherever an elite panzer division was deployed, both friend and enemy understood that the German command expected something decisive, but by the period in which this disaster unfolded, the strategic environment had shifted sharply. The Wehrmacht was engaged on multiple fronts. Supply lines stretched thin, and air superiority, once taken for granted in lightning campaigns, had become a rare luxury. The division at the center of this story had already been worn down by months of operations. Replacements had arrived, but many were young and lacked the combat experience of the veterans they replaced. Fuel stocks were unreliable, coordination between armor and infantry fluctuated, and the skies above were increasingly hostile. The terrain would play a role as lethal as any opposing formation. The region west of the Meuse, characterized by narrow country roads, thick hedgerows, waterlogged fields, and scattered villages, offered little room for the sweeping maneuvers German doctrine had been built upon. Instead of rapid exploitation and deep thrusts, the division found itself funneled into predictable routes, the kind the enemy had already mapped and prepared for. Artillery observers, anti-tank crews, and forward air controllers positioned themselves along likely approach lines, waiting for a sign of movement. German intelligence underestimated the scale and readiness of the forces massed against them. Reports suggested that the enemy was still reorganizing, but in reality, they had studied the division's patterns and understood its vulnerabilities: the dependence on fuel, the need for clean avenues of advance, and the brittle nature of communications when under pressure. The enemy's armoured units had improved significantly. Their anti-tank guns were more lethal than their earlier war counterparts, and their air forces now operated with growing confidence. Inside the division's command posts, tension built steadily. Intercepts hinted at encirclement plans. Supply trucks were delayed. Field officers reported shortages of ammunition and spare parts. The mood among the older NCOs reflected something rarely heard in German armoured units: uncertainty. They had seen divisions collapse before when the pace of battle outstripped their logistical limits, and they recognized the early signs here: hurried redeployments, shifting orders, and an absence of reliable reconnaissance. When the enemy launched their opening strikes, it wasn't a single blow but a coordinated sequence designed to overwhelm the division's ability to respond. Artillery cut off the rear elements first, hammering the supporting units and destroying radio trucks essential for maintaining control. Forward companies, already spread thin along the winding roads, suddenly found their positions isolated. What began as a tactical disruption quickly became an operational crisis. The division was no longer fighting for momentum, it was fighting to maintain cohesion. And yet, even as pressure mounted, the division's leadership believed they could stabilize the line if they reacted quickly enough. Orders went out for counter-thrusts, for fighting withdrawals, for re-establishing links with support battalions. But each hour brought new setbacks. Fuel depots were hit, bridges were lost, weather-grounded Germans spotting aircraft while the enemy's fighter bombers roamed aggressively overhead. In this tightening vise, the stage was set for a 4-day ordeal that would push the Panzer division beyond its physical and psychological limits, an ordeal that can only be understood by viewing it from every angle of the battlefield. The men who served inside the division felt the strain of the coming disaster long before the first shells fell. Veterans noticed how the new replacements flinched at distant artillery or tightened their grip on their rifles when aircraft passed overhead. Sleep came in short, fractured moments, broken by the grind of tracked vehicles or the sudden orders to shift positions in the dark. In makeshift aid stations, medics whispered about the number of exhaustion cases rising with each day. These soldiers, once confident in the power of their armored formation, now faced the creeping realization that fuel shortages and broken communication lines were becoming deadlier than the enemy. The human weight of uncertainty settled heavily over the ranks, tightening its grip as the hours passed, and it was within this strain that the first cracks began to appear. The tactical picture grew worse by the hour. The division had trained to fight with speed and initiative, but the battlefield now denied both. Vehicles were forced into column after column along narrow farm roads, each movement predictable and vulnerable. Anti-tank teams lay hidden in hedgerows, waiting for the metallic rattle of approaching armor. Once the first panzer in a column was struck, everything behind it halted, turning the road into a target-rich trap. Artillery observers, positioned on small rises or inside church towers, relayed precise coordinates to enemy batteries. The Germans attempted to push through, but each attempt only invited new barrages that shattered tracks, disabled engines, and blocked escape routes. Tactical freedom, once the heart of panzer warfare, evaporated under the relentless pressure, leaving commanders to fight moment to moment rather than shape the field. Technological imbalance deepened the crisis. Early in the war, German armor and doctrine had dominated through superior coordination, but by this stage the battlefield had transformed. Enemy tanks possessed thicker armor and more powerful guns, capable of knocking out panzers from ranges that negated many of the Germans' usual advantages. Their self-propelled anti-tank weapons, dug into the landscape and shielded by terrain, punished any exposed movement. Above the field, fighter bombers circled persistently, waiting for columns to appear. Whenever German engines roared, aircraft descended, releasing rockets and bombs with growing precision. Radio interference, damage to command vehicles, and the destruction of signal crews meant tanks often fought blind, unable to request artillery support or coordinate with infantry. Machines that had once symbolized German invincibility were now outmatched by an enemy that had adapted, improved, and learned how to dismantle armored thrusts with methodical efficiency. Leadership within the division strained to maintain order as the situation deteriorated. Commanders who had built their reputations on bold maneuvers now faced a battlefield that punished aggression and rewarded patience, a trait in short supply when retreat routes were shrinking. Orders changed rapidly as reports arrived piecemeal, each one contradicting the last. Officers rode between companies under fire, attempting to relay instructions personally when radios failed. Some urged counterattacks to break enemy pressure, while others pleaded for a withdrawal before they were encircled. The command staff worked without rest, running maps under shaking lamps and calculating how long their remaining fuel would last. They understood that if the division could not reorganize, it would fracture completely. The strain on leadership became a battle of its own, fought with limited information and a clock that never slowed. Across the battlefield, the enemy viewed the unfolding situation with clarity the Panzer division no longer possessed. Reconnaissance units had charted the terrain thoroughly, marking every bottleneck, every vulnerable crossroads, and every high point suitable for artillery spotting. Their infantry battalions coordinated closely with armoured brigades, creating layered defences that absorbed German attacks and countered with overwhelming precision. When German units attempted breakout thrusts, enemy formations shifted deliberately, blocking escape corridors and applying pressure where the division was weakest. Reports circulated among their ranks that a renowned German armoured formation was faltering, a prospect that strengthened their resolve. They recognized that the next 96 hours offered an opportunity not just to repel an attack, but to effectively remove a formidable division from the battlefield. Their advance, though measured, carried the confidence of troops who knew they held both material advantage and strategic control. With each passing hour, the noose tightened further, bringing the Panzer division closer to its breaking point and setting the stage for a decisive moment from which there would be no recovery. The turning point came on the morning of the third day, when fog lifted just enough for both sides to see the battlefield take shape. For the Panzer division, it was the moment when hope narrowed into a single, fragile possibility: break west before the enemy closed the last corridor. Commanders gathered what armor they had left, a mix of medium tanks, assault guns, and hastily repaired vehicles pulled from workshops, and formed a spearhead meant to punch through the tightening ring. The order went out shortly after 0600. Engines rumbled to life, exhaust fumes mixing with the cold air as officers signaled their crews forward. Initially, the advance gained momentum. The enemy had not expected a counter-thrust with such determination, and forward units fell back from the opening blows. But as the German column reached a shallow rise overlooking a crossroads, the battlefield shifted violently. Hidden anti-tank guns opened fire from both flanks, their first volleys destroying the lead vehicles and trapping the rest in a bottleneck. Tank commanders shouted for smoke, but artillery had already targeted the choke point. Shells rained down with a precision that shattered any chance of maneuver. Crews bailed from burning hulls, only to be pinned by machine gunfire sweeping the ditches. By late morning, the situation deteriorated further. Enemy aircraft swarmed overhead, diving low to strike any vehicle that tried to reverse out of the kill zone. A single rocket strike disabled a crucial recovery tank, sealing the road behind wreckage that crews could not move under fire. In less than 2 hours, the entire breakout attempt had turned into a trap that consumed much of the division's remaining strength. Officers tried to regroup scattered survivors, but radio contact collapsed again, leaving units isolated and unaware of the broader picture. At 1300 hours, the enemy launched their own coordinated assault. Infantry battalions pushed forward behind a rolling artillery barrage, advancing methodically toward the shattered German positions. The panzers that remained attempted to anchor a defensive line, firing from defilade positions and using what ammunition they had left to slow the advance. Some fought until their barrels overheated, others remained immobile, engines dead, crews operating them like fixed bunkers. The division's anti-aircraft guns joined the effort, targeting ground forces when no aircraft were present. But their crews were exposed and took heavy casualties. By mid-afternoon, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Reports from reconnaissance elements indicated that enemy forces had reached the division's rear and were preparing to close the final escape route. Field officers pleaded for permission to retreat while it was still possible. But the command staff hesitated, torn between standing their ground and risking total encirclement. The window for decision-making shrank with every minute of artillery fire. The final break in the division's cohesion came around 1700 hours, when a fuel depot, one of the last reserves intended for the next withdrawal, was hit by a direct airstrike. The explosion ripped through the woodland, sending fireballs into the sky and destroying the supplies the entire division depended on. Without fuel, even the surviving vehicles could not reposition. Crews watched the flames consume their last chance to move. Infantry units, now cut off from armored support, fell back in small groups, each trying to avoid incoming fire and find any route to safety. As night approached, the division ceased to function as a unified force. Companies dissolved into scattered elements. Tanks lay gutted along roadside ditches. Officers who had once commanded battle groups now led a handful of exhausted survivors. The 96-hour nightmare had entered its final phase, and what happened next would determine not victory or defeat, but how many would escape the tightening ring around them. When dawn arrived on the fourth day, it revealed the full scale of the collapse. What had once been an elite armored formation, a division known for discipline, speed, and cohesion, now existed only as scattered pockets of men attempting to evade capture. The enemy pressed forward with steady confidence, moving through positions that the panzers had occupied just hours earlier. Smoke still drifted from destroyed vehicles, many of them burned down to skeletal frames. Ammunition had cooked off inside turrets during the night, leaving twisted metal and blackened earth where battle lines once stood. Surviving officers attempted to assemble coherent groups, but their efforts were limited by the terrain and by the speed of the encirclement. Columns that tried to move west found blocked roads, littered with wreckage. Others faced enemy roadblocks, reinforced by tanks and anti-tank guns. Soldiers who had marched with their division across earlier campaigns now moved cautiously through woods and fields, carrying whatever equipment they had saved during the collapse. Many had thrown away heavy gear during breakouts, taking only rifles, water, and a few precious rounds. The psychological burden weighed heavily. Each man understood the division no longer existed in any functional capacity. Captured German crewmen later described the shock of encountering enemy patrols deep behind what they believed was their own line. Reports from these post-war interrogations note how many German soldiers were confused about the direction of safety, having lost all sense of orientation during the chaotic final retreat. Some wandered into villages only to be met by infantry battalions that had cut the supply routes during the night. Others surrendered near crossroads after realizing they were surrounded and out of ammunition. For the enemy, the operation was considered a major success. Intelligence summaries noted the destruction or disablement of a significant number of armored vehicles, including tanks, assault guns, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. Several battalions had been effectively wiped out, while others suffered casualties so severe they could no longer operate independently. The enemy command recognized that removing such a division from the battlefield opened a gap in German operational capability that could not be easily repaired. Reports emphasized the precision of artillery coordination, the impact of air superiority, and the effectiveness of blocking positions that prevented German escape. German High Command received initial fragments of information late on the fourth day. Radio messages, often incomplete or interrupted, described heavy losses, units cut off, and the disappearance of entire companies. Attempts to mount relief operations proved impossible. Other formations were already stretched thin, fighting their own battles across a widening front. Official records from surviving staff officers stated plainly that the division was no longer capable of fulfilling combat tasks, a phrase that marked its practical end. Its remaining armor would later be collected, repaired if possible, and reassigned in small numbers to other formations, but the division's identity had been broken beyond recovery. In the days that followed, military photographers and analysts walked the battlefield to document the results. Rows of destroyed vehicles marked the Panzer Division's final withdrawal attempts. Craters lined the roads where artillery had halted the breakout. Abandoned field kitchens, supply trucks, and medical wagons told the story of a force that had tried desperately to remain organized even as its structure dissolved. Diaries recovered from the field revealed the progression of fear, frustration, and resignation felt by the men during the 96-hour ordeal. The collapse left a deep mark not only on the landscape, but on the strategic calculations of German leadership. It demonstrated how quickly an elite formation, one that had earned its reputation across earlier victories, could be dismantled once air superiority, logistics, and maneuver space shifted decisively against it. The battlefield had changed, and the division had paid the price for fighting in conditions that no longer favored the doctrine that once made it powerful. The nightmare had ended, but its consequences would echo through every remaining armored campaign Germany attempted. The destruction of the Panzer Division over those 96 hours stands as one of the many turning points that revealed the deeper reality of late war-armored combat. For years, the German army had relied on the speed and precision of its armored forces to transform local advantages into sweeping operational victories. But wars do not remain static. Tactics evolve, technology shifts, and the enemy learns. What happened in those fields west of the Meuse was not simply the defeat of a single formation. It was the collision between past doctrine and a new form of warfare that no longer allowed the panzers to dominate as they once had. The battlefield had become an environment shaped by artillery nets, layered defenses, and aircraft that could intervene at will. Where early war armor could maneuver freely, later war-armored units were forced into predictable paths by terrain, logistics, and the growing reach of enemy firepower. The division's collapse illustrated this unmistakably. Even the courage and experience of its crews could not overcome the limitations imposed by dwindling fuel, broken communications, and an opponent who had mastered the art of denying maneuver. In earlier campaigns, the division's aggressive thrusts might have changed the course of an entire front. Here, those same instincts led it directly into prepared kill zones. There is also a human reflection embedded in the ruins left behind. Many of the soldiers who fought during those 4 days had once believed themselves nearly invincible, shaped by the victories of earlier years. Their collapse forced them to confront not only physical defeat, but the erosion of the doctrine, training, and faith that had guided their service. The battlefield stripped away the illusions created by propaganda and revealed the stark weight of modern industrial war. Steel, fuel, coordination, and air power, These shaped outcomes more decisively than bravery alone. For the enemy, the operation reinforced their growing confidence. It demonstrated that disciplined planning, intelligence-driven positioning, and technological superiority could dismantle even the most experienced of German armoured formations. This realization would influence operations that followed, encouraging strategies that targeted logistics, isolated armoured elements, and neutralized mobility, the very foundation on which German mechanized warfare had been built. In the broader sweep of history, the 96-hour nightmare serves as a reminder that no military system remains dominant forever. Adaptation is constant. Strength in one era can become vulnerability in the next. The Panzer division's fall was not the result of a single mistake, but the culmination of structural weaknesses exposed under the pressure of a new battlefield reality. Its destruction echoed far beyond the smoke-filled fields, influencing commanders, shaping strategic thinking, and reminding future generations that even elite forces can be undone when the conditions that once empowered them slip away. And as the fields west of the Meuse fell silent again, the last traces of the division faded into history, a symbol not of early triumphs, but of the moment when time, terrain, and technology finally caught up with one of Germany's proudest armoured formations.